So I'm joined by Jasmine El-Gamal, who's a foreign policy analyst, the host of the podcast The View from Here, and a former Middle East advisor at the Pentagon during the Obama administration. It's great to talk with you, Jasmine, about Iran, because where are we on this merry-go-round? Will they, won't they sign a deal? We hear one thing one day from President Trump, and it's complete opposite just 2 days later. Where are we, and where are we headed?
That's right. And Hala, it's so nice to be with you. Thank you for having me on. We're in a very familiar place right now. We've seen this cycle, as you mentioned, this merry-go-round over the last 6 months now, where you have President Trump saying something or threatening something online, and
Mhm.
then literally sometimes within hours, you have him saying something completely different. And there's a few different reasons for that. You know, on one hand, he's trying to use it as a negotiating tactic. He's also trying to soothe markets at certain times.
Mhm.
You'll notice that oftentimes in the past, he will make the threat on a Friday, and then, on a Monday, he'll say, "Oh, now we're talking again. I changed my mind. I've called off the strikes." So
Yeah.
there's a lot going on behind the scenes. There's also his emotions. Donald Trump is a very emotional leader. He's led by his emotions, his
Mhm.
frustrations, his ego. And so a lot of what he says in public is literally what he is feeling at the time, which is not helpful for analysts to try to figure out what's happening. It's also not very helpful, as we know from speaking to them and from reporting. It's not
Mhm.
helpful for the interlocutors or the mediators who are trying to figure out what the US position is. So where
Right.
we are right now, after a few months of this, of course, we had the MOU that was signed, the Memorandum of Understanding. It very quickly fell apart because the language was too vague for it to really stick. Each side
Mhm.
inevitably um, looked at it and interpreted it differently. And where we are now is the two parties are looking like they are starting to talk again, but with different interlocutors, not necessarily directly with each other.
And we keep hearing that the US military is under pressure, that maybe they're even running out of defensive weaponry. I mean, is there truth to that, or is that something that they're saying to maybe, you know, kind of make Iran think that they're in a weaker position and kind of then, strike again with renewed force? What do you think those statements? Because we're hearing from high-level military officials that they feel under pressure in that regard.
I think the military is definitely feeling under pressure in several ways, not only because they've expended a lot of um, air defense, missile defense, personnel. There's so much that has gone into waging this war over the last 6 months, and those military leaders have to think about things that the president or maybe the State Department even doesn't necessarily instinctively think about.
Mhm.
Think about, for example, the aircraft carriers and the
Yeah.
ships that are at sea. All of those assets contain personnel, human beings that have been on these ships for months and months on end. And if you know anything about the life of a naval soldier, it's very tough. They can't get off the ship, they can't go to shore. I saw an interview with one of them who had missed the birth of his daughter. I mean, these are things that commanders have to keep in mind when it comes to the health of the force, the morale of the force, in addition to the actual hardware that they're fighting with. They
Mhm.
also have to think in terms of protecting military assets. So you've seen military assets recently being moved towards Israel and Jordan to be out of reach of Iranian firepower. All of these different moves are under consideration and put pressure on the military. And those are some of the conversations that the military leadership is having with President Trump and having within these National Security Council meetings, where they are trying to convince the president that doing the same thing is not going to yield different results.
But we didn't have to, this is not a situation we had to be in, right? Because this war didn't have to be waged. The attack didn't have to happen on February 28th. The goal was, I presume just decapitating the regime and maybe installing a friendly leader in Iran. That didn't work. So that deterrent power that the US had is gone, right? Because, I mean, Iran wasn't doing things like blocking the Strait of Hormuz because they didn't want to get bombed. Now it's been bombed. So they can just block one day and unblock the next, right? So where does that leave the US?
Yeah, exactly. And actually, Hala, even the Iranians don't even have to actually bomb anymore. They can just threaten to
Yeah,
bomb.
yeah.
And that will be enough to make insurers think twice about insuring ships or how much they charge for insurance. And that price increase is going to be passed on to the consumer. So Iran can do damage even without doing
Mhm.
anything. That's really the more dangerous aspect of this is that we now know how vulnerable the Strait of Hormuz is and how little it takes to capitalize on that
Yeah,
vulnerability if you're the Iranians. Now, you mentioned a very, very important point, which is deterrence capacity. There are two words that are being discussed right now. You and I were talking earlier about credibility as well. So I want to just touch upon both of those words, credibility and deterrence. Now, back again during the Red Line episode with President Obama, one of the arguments that was being made was at the time was, Mr. President, if you don't do something, if you don't follow up on your threat to
hmm
uphold this red line, our credibility is going to be shot, and that is going to have huge ramifications. Now, in hindsight, President Obama didn't do anything.
hmm
And it didn't really impact US credibility in tangible ways. The US was still the US and
hmm
it operated, accordingly. And even to this day, you will find that even if countries don't want to deal with the US, oftentimes they find that they have to. So credibility is an important characteristic, an important quality to have as the US, but I would argue, and maybe you have a different point of view, I can certainly debate this with you, it's not a make or break. Now, when it comes to deterrence, that's completely different. And what has been really shattered here is not just US credibility. Of course, yes, but that's happened before, and it's happened with President Trump before as well. What's really different here, I would argue, is the deterrence capability of the
Yeah,
US. The US has now been exposed in that it cannot necessarily win a war, even though it is the mightiest superpower and the most advanced fighting force in the world. That still doesn't mean that it can win a war. And all of our adversaries and our partners have gotten that lesson in real time, watching us unable to quote unquote win in the way that Donald Trump uh, um, uh, describes
yeah.
winning or defines winning.
Certainly by
And
conventional
that I
means.
would argue
Yeah.
is really dangerous.
Certainly by conventional means against a regime in Iran that has been preparing for this eventuality, that is using asymmetric warfare very, very effectively, and also has a geographic position. I mean, this is really what maybe was not studied enough. I don't know about the Pentagon, but certainly in the White House, it doesn't seem like Iran's position as being able to control and block the Strait of Hormuz easily was taken into account necessarily in the calculations. But you were a Middle East advisor at the Pentagon during the Obama administration. What do you think the conversations are like right now inside the Pentagon?
Absolutely. I think it is about options and how to get the US out of this impossible situation that it's put itself in. Because what you just said is exactly right. The US has it has shown that it cannot conventionally win a war. It cannot do regime change from the air. There are all of these things that have become clear over the last 6 months that the US cannot do. But just as importantly, it's not only the limitations of US military power, it's also the limitations of the US as a democracy in
Mhm.
having freedom of movement. So, for example, technically speaking, the US probably can do regime change in Iran, but essentially it cannot because Congress will not allow for a US ground invasion. The American public won't stand for it. The markets, cannot afford it. And so the US is constrained by so many factors other than its pure military assets. And that's
Mhm.
something that the Iranians know. So they know they can manipulate the US and put pressure on it, not just through fighting, but through pressuring President Trump domestically, increasing the cost on global financial markets, and so on. So, what the Pentagon's role will be at this moment is trying to find options for the president to be able or to decide whether continued military action is the right tool to be using right now in the US's diplomatic toolbox. And if the answer is no, what other options are there? That's where the Secretary of State
Right.
comes in, other departments. If the answer is yes, what moves do we have that we haven't utilized so far so that we're not doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results? And what are the risks associated with that? So you will have seen the CNN was covering this and other news outlets, this reported email that had gone out from the US military asking military analysts and planners, we need you to think creatively. We need you to help us think outside the box. What can we do to pressure the Iranians? And the problem is that they're asking the wrong question. They're trying to coerce the Iranians into movement when actually what has been proven is that the Iranians can withstand incredible amounts of military pressure and financial pressure. And so the question really should be, how do we move forward from this at the negotiating table when there is zero trust and when the goals of the two parties appear to be so zero sum?
What about Israel in all of this? We heard from the late Lindsey Graham in a video that was released by the Wall Street Journal, who was speaking to Benjamin Netanyahu on day one of the Israeli-US attack on Iran, just absolutely gleeful that finally he had been able to convince Donald Trump to go ahead and attack Iran. And they were both absolutely delighted by this development. Netanyahu was in Washington last week. He was asked by an interviewer, did you try to convince Donald Trump? Is it because of you that the US basically got dragged into this quagmire? And he said, not at all. But we know that that's what, you know, many people have said and believe that this is what was at the urging of Netanyahu, that Donald Trump ordered this attack.
There is no question that Israel and particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, in concert and coordination with the late Senator Lindsey Graham, were absolutely essential in Donald Trump's decision to go to war. Now, I always say the buck stops with the president, right? Because Prime Minister Netanyahu had tried this with previous presidents, including President Obama. President Obama chose to go the negotiated route, was able to finalize the JCPOA. So
Mhm.
pressure from the Israelis is not enough. The US president obviously makes the final decision. That said, this had been an intense, intense pressure campaign. Prime Minister Netanyahu, in the months leading up to the war, had been to the White House 7 times.
Mhm.
And when he wasn't at the White House, Senator Lindsey Graham was in Washington. And I heard from people who had close knowledge of the conversations Lindsey Graham was having with President Trump, and they were in service of getting President Trump to do a regime change war. So that is not in question. It's interesting. And of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, shortly after the war started, could not contain, his glee and
Mhm.
his excitement. He said himself, this has been a 40-year dream of mine to get the US and Iran to do this together. So this was coming out of his own mouth. Now, things are very different now because the war has gone very badly, as you and I were just discussing. The American public is against this war, does not understand why we are doing what we're doing, and is very upset, the American public, at the notion that the Israelis pushed us into this war,